Hello, welcome to another episode of China in Our World podcast. Today is May 17th, 2020, and with your host, Tom Pauken, which is me, and I am the author of U.S. vs. China, From Trade War to Reciprocal Deal, and I'm also an Asia-Pacific Affairs commentator based here in Beijing.
Hi, Tom. Nice to see you again. My name is Edward Tse, T-S-E. I'm a management and strategy consultant. I'm currently in Hong Kong.
Okay, sounds good. Now, as I mentioned in our prior podcast, we're going to focus now more on the issue of the economic rebound, moving away from the ideas of lockdowns and coronavirus, and emphasize more on economic issues. So while we're now focusing more on an economic rebound in the United States and China and the rest of the world, right now there is a big issue about how to reopen the economy. Is it possible? What is the right approach to reopen the economy? Edward Zha, what do you believe is the right approach right now to reopen the economies in China and in other countries?
Well, first of all, whether or not a certain country or a region is ready to reopen, with the pandemic, whether it's entirely safe and so on. Obviously, it's a judgment by the leadership of the country or the state or the city and so on. And so it really depends, right? But it's very important that the leaders have to think carefully through the trade-off between public health and economic recovery. Both are very important. We know that. And it's always a very tough situation for political leaders to make this sort of tough decision. So, I think we need to give credit to many of the political leaders who have, gone out of their limb to make tough decisions as to whether or not to open up, to start the recovery, or to continue to sort of lock down and to make sure that people's lives are protected and so on. But I think we're seeing, because our show is focusing on China and the U.S., so let's focus on China and the U.S. now.
Sure.
China has, of course, been the first to have the outbreak, but also is among the first, if not the first, to, in a way, to manage the outbreak. And now, in general, for the whole country, while there's still some cases of infections, it's still largely so already under control. Whereas in the U.S., unfortunately, things are still not 100% out of the woods from the public health standpoint. However, at least based on my direct interactions with many of my friends in America, many of them have become quite not very comfortable by being locked down for a long time. I think
how we Americans are.
It's human nature.
You can't keep us as prisoners.
It's a human nature, right? And I guess in particular for Americans, which is a free spirit. So, so I think in America we also understand that there's now a process going on. At least if we look at how China has been undertaking the economic recovery, it's not easy, because China is part of the world. In particular, China has been the largest trading nation for large number of countries in the world, and whereas many other countries are still in the midst of the pandemic, the ability to trade with the other countries has been short-circuited, right, from a Chinese perspective. So China can only focus on trying to remobilize its local economy. Local economy in China, of course, is still very significant in size. And the methods that the Chinese government are now undertaking to regenerate the economy in China are really three things. One is through investment, meaning investing into infrastructure, in particular in what is called now the new forms of infrastructure, meaning digital infrastructure, and also providing fiscal stimulus and other sort of financial policies to really stimulate the economy. So that's one part. Second part is to encourage more consumption, right? Is to allow or encourage the consumers to create more spending. And you can already see in the last several weeks, there's been a rebound in the sales of a range of many products.
I witnessed it firsthand. Yes,
Like-
it's very
like
crowded in the truck now.
like cars, right? And you know, I'm sure when you go around many of the retail stores, you see lines sort of lining up. So
Yes.
you know, so that's another mechanism that the Chinese government have been using to regenerate the economy. The third mechanism is to encourage innovation. Is to, of course, innovation is riding on technology, but the Chinese entrepreneurs are extremely, as you know, Tom, they are extremely dynamic, and they are very business savvy, and they're also very technically or technologically in tune with what's happening in the world. So they can very quickly turn the cutting edge knowledge on technology and apply it in a commercial sense. And you see, I'm sure, Tom, you know, in China, how innovations are happening with very high speed and also incredible intensity. So with these mechanisms, right, there are three levers: investment, consumption, as well as innovations. We are now seeing an uptick in the Chinese economy, at least in the domestic side.
Yeah.
Internationally, including the trade with many other countries, it will take some more time because the rest of the world is still very much in the midst of fighting the pandemic.
And it's very interesting you bring up the 3 points, because I read the news all the time about China. I'm obsessed, and that's part of my job, I guess. And recently, everyone is all the China haters have been all excited because they're saying, "Oh my gosh, the Chinese manufacturing is going down. The exports are going to go down. The companies are moving. The manufacturers are leaving the country. They're going to go back home. They're gonna create these problems for the Chinese economy." But when you mentioned your 3 points, none of them had anything to do with manufacturing or exports. And the reason I want to mention that is because the reality is, Edward, you're right, that China is taking the right approach to improve its economy. I believe the new trend that is happening, and everyone I'm talking to, is the new trend is localization. Focus on your domestic manufacturing, focus on your domestic consumption, as well as innovation, as you had just talked about. So it looks like, you know, China is already had this plan a long time ago, that they realized that, you know, Chinese manufacturing and export is not always going to rescue their economy. So it seems as if this coronavirus is just accelerating the trend towards localization. And I see that as a benefit, not only for the US, but also for China. What are your thoughts on this, Edward?
I think a number of things going to happen at the same time post the pandemic period.
Okay.
You're right. You know, there's been a lot of talk about sort of the end of globalization. In fact, I believe the cover page for The Economist for this week or the last week, or this week actually.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting to point out here is that localism, as I said, is going to be a major trend. And now when you have localization, that means the localization of supply chains, the localization of manufacturing, as well as the localization of consumption markets. So Edward, as you mentioned earlier, when you're talking about your 3 principles, most of it sounded like it was headed towards the direction of localization for China's rebound. And this is exactly what I see happening with the US. But the trick is it could be problematic, is that we may be going to too far an extreme where suddenly now the U.S. does not want to trade with China, and then China does not want to trade with the U.S. We're headed towards a decoupling. Do you see this as a big concern, Edward, that we could be headed towards a decoupling between the two richest and most powerful countries in the world?
I don't see any major risk of a total decoupling.
Okay.
There are, of course, there are boundaries that are now being drawn by the U.S. government as far as what the Chinese companies can do or cannot do, right? When it comes to doing business with the U.S. and vice versa, the Chinese also drawn their own boundary of national security for the U.S. and foreign companies. I think that's the prerogative for any government. And so, one can debate whether or not the national security boundaries are reasonable or not, and so on. I think that's a different topic. But that boundary cannot include everything in the world.
Yes.
I think we've been talking about it, before. Whereas for some of the so-called high-tech industries, the U.S. may consider some of the Chinese companies as having technology that's a little bit too sensitive, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
But if we are talking about general consumer stuff or retail, I think we talk about Starbucks before, right? Starbucks is a Starbucks is a Starbucks, and it doesn't really matter whether you drink a cup of Starbucks in the Bay Area or in Beijing. More or less the same. The ambience is more or less the same, pricing is more or less the same, and the profit will go back to the Starbucks shareholders. I don't see a decoupling. In fact, I see an increasing prevalence of global brands that cuts across boundaries like the U.S. or China and so on. Ultimately, who's going to win in this game is who have the capabilities or the ability to compete in a very competitive market, right? Because increasingly, the world is going to even continue to be even more competitive because, as for the reason we talk about, the world requires more innovations. So even if you just mix coffees, you cannot just stand still and keep on making the same coffee for 30 years. You've got to innovate and continue to innovate. That's why Starbucks is investing big time, as you know, in Shanghai to build the leading edge sort of what they call roastery. Roastery is where, in a way, the flagship, right? The cooler stuff from Starbucks. And that's being built in Shanghai and China. Huge investment from Starbucks. So I think, in some sense, there's some degree of decoupling, but in a major sense, the world cannot be decoupled. Not political rhetoric cannot decouple humanity at the everyday level.
And I also I think I agree with you there too. It's you can take it, you can move in one direction, but if you go to extreme, you're going to get a bounce back or new problems that you did not expect from it.
Exactly.
So
and I think that you're right. My personal view is that the notion of so-called globalism and the notion of so-called the pushback on China, in a way, is both the fact that the Chinese were so good in their ability to improve whatever they put their hands onto, in particular in manufacturing. As you know, it took China several decades to go from nowhere in manufacturing to really the factory of the world, right? So the Chinese are very, very good in doing that. And the Chinese were so good that they have left themselves a major blind side, which is, I don't believe or I think a major oversight of the Chinese is to think through, well, if we keep on doing this in this way, what would that mean for the rest of the world? In particular, what does it mean? What would it mean for our biggest trading partner, i.e. America or the USA.
Yeah.
I think that notion of having empathy or at least some degree of understanding on
Yeah.
where the other side is coming from,
Mm-hmm.
I think that certainly needs to be improved from a Chinese perspective, in my view.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I've seen it firsthand. It's like
I picked that up, Tom. I let you talk because I know that you have firsthand because you live in
yeah, exactly.
your hometown is Texas. But
Yeah,
I talked to my friends in America,
yeah,
and some of my friends are ex-colleagues and ex-clients of mine, and
sure.
they used to work with me in China. They're
Yeah,
now back in America, and they said,
sure.
Ed, when I came back, I went around I moved to Midwest. I look around and I say
Yeah,
things are really horrible.
yeah,
It's hollowing out. Everything is hollowing out.
exactly.
And
Yeah,
when I was in Shanghai, meaning my friend, when I was in Shanghai, it's a totally another story, right? So
sure.
I think that's the issue. When you're in Shanghai or Beijing, or when you
Yeah,
try to grow, right? You you you
yeah,
you see the progress you made. You reap the
mhm,
benefits, and
yeah,
you're proud of all your achievement. But
sure.
you sometimes have the blind side and saying you don't really appreciate
Yeah,
as much the downside on the other side. And I'll let you talk because Tom, I know that
yeah. No,
you
because
see the
this is
both
a
sides, right?
major issue, and this is, I think, why you're going to have major uh, arguments and disagreements between the U.S. and China. And you're pointing out, I think, actually the fundamental reason is that China was too successful. And I had just recently read a report from a geopolitical strategist who spent some time with the U.S. State Department, and he already admitted the U.S. is losing and China is winning. Um, and for Americans, that's very hard to accept. I mean, especially when it's China that's winning. So with this concept it's sort of like, one thing I do admire about Chinese philosophy, and when I talk to Chinese, is they're always talking about balance. There's a yin and there's a yang. So if you don't have a balance, there's going to be that tension that's going to create a major problem. So because China was so successful, eventually America's going to say, wait a minute, this is too much. And yeah, you're right. When I did talk to the Chinese people about 2-3 years ago, and I said, this trade war, the Americans really support the trade wars. Why do you think they elected Trump? Many Chinese just did not understand. They're like, well, but Americans can get cheaper prices. They don't have to pay as much. And I'm like, yes, but when you don't have a job, prices don't matter.
Exactly. I think
Yeah,
that's what I meant, Tom, is that
yeah,
obviously the Americans have a certain narrative. The Chinese
sure,
also have a certain narrative.
of course.
Unfortunately, the Chinese narrative is too China-centric. I would
Yeah,
encourage the Chinese to also take a look from the
yes,
other side, from America's side, from Europe's side, from other places' side, and even frankly, a lot of other developing nations, because
yeah,
ultimately, uh, I think the pandemic also is exposing even a bigger problem, which is not just
sure.
U.S. and China. It is actually how the inequality is being even more exaggerated
Yeah,
across the world through pandemic, but also the economic outcome of the
yeah.
pandemic. I mean, it's incredible that distribution, right, between the have and have not is becoming
Sure.
even more significant. And
Oh, I know.
I believe that it is the responsibility of great powers like the U.S. and China, and to some extent, Europe and other places, to
Sure.
try to work together to try to address this issue. Because if the developing nations are suffering and they're going to have major problems, then,
They will get hit the hardest.
well,
When there's always a crisis, the ones who are the weakest get hit hardest.
and the rest of the world will get hit as
Well,
well,
they get
right?
hit hard, but it's going to be the weakest who always end up hardest hit. They have the least ability to recover.
So it
And
requires a lot
yeah,
of wisdom and also a lot of foresight, onto resetting our priority in life, right? What it ought to be
mhm,
our priorities, ought to be our moral compass. How do we sort of set the priorities right so that we do the right things? So I think this requires, as we were talking about, more mutual understanding
Yeah.
between the Chinese side and the American side. And it's
Right.
not just simply we are relying on the old narratives that each side have developed over the years. And I think the two narratives are not hit, they're not,
No, I know. There's a major roadblock.
they're
Major
roadblocks,
roadblock.
right? And we need to find out, other avenues of the narrative that actually would make things work. And I believe there are actually. I think they exist. It's just a matter of how do we actually create them.
Well, when people talk to me about this issue and they ask for my suggestions, I often say, well, why not the Chinese invest in other countries? That's what America did. They invested in a lot of other countries, and I believe that also established a lot of goodwill, is their ability. Not only did they focus on the U.S. economy, but they, of course, opened up the factories elsewhere. But what I'm trying to get at is that the Chinese, sometimes they just focus on their factories either in China or Southeast Asia. But why not them opening up more factories in the US or in Europe? I know it costs more. I know the labor wages are high. But if you want to create goodwill, maybe you're just going to have to open up factories there, similar to what Toyota did. I think a major success story is Toyota, because I know firsthand, I had seen the factory in Irving, Texas from Toyota. It's huge. It's massive. Very impressive. And I think that's a major reason why Toyota is a success story in America. I just think the Chinese companies are just going to have to take the same approach, and then that can sort of lessen tensions between the two countries. What is your opinion?
I agree. In fact, I think as always, it's going to be a two-way process. One way is for the Chinese to become more globalized or more multinational. In a nice way, right? Not in a bad way, right?
Yeah.
Being a multinational meaning taking up the responsibility of being corporate citizens across many parts of the world, and look out for the well-being of the stakeholders in every locations that they set up their operations, right? And while a small amount of Chinese companies are already, on its way and doing a pretty good job, but they are a minority among the vast number of Chinese companies. Most Chinese companies are still largely domestically focused. For those who are dabbling into so-called overseas market, they're simply dabbling into putting the toe into the water and test the water, right? And some of them have multi-location operations, but they're by no means multinational or international companies, in the same measures as the leading American multinationals.
Yeah.
So I think the Chinese have a long ways to come, but I think the Chinese can really learn to become better multinational companies where they play a much more responsible role from the corporate responsibility standpoint, and try to help each of the local community that they are in, and try to improve the utility of the stakeholders within where they are. I think the American companies have been doing, in general, has been doing a pretty good job over the years. Of course, some did a better job than some others, but largely speaking, American companies were the drivers for internationalization since the end of the Second World War, and many of the largest American companies really spearheaded the globalization effort. And I think that's also one of the reasons why the living conditions for many people in many other countries in the world, including India and China for the matter, have risen up in the last several decades, right? I think American companies can continue to do that, especially in China, with the opening up of additional market segments for American companies, like in financial services, in banking, asset management, securities, and so on. Allows more access for American companies to come in, and American companies should go in and, tap the market and really capture the rightful potential that the China market offers to them. So if we do this, right, again, do this way,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure, there are going to be synergies that's going to be created along the way.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. And as long as the communication is there, and I think one of the weaknesses on the Chinese side I've noticed a lot is just communication.
Yeah,
a lot of times when I talk to Chinese people, I have to keep asking tons and tons of questions just to find out what they're really thinking. Americans are always saying what we're thinking. There's no surprise. But with Chinese, I sometimes have to do a lot of interrogation just to find out that one answer that on that missing piece of the puzzle. Well, but I think, yeah, go ahead.
It's two different, two very different cultures, right? We talk about that.
Yeah.
In a way, of course, the language, i.e., English, also make a difference. But taking out, just taking out the notion of the language, the culture, the underlying culture is quite different. In our culture, in the Chinese culture, at school, we are much more, we provide more emphasis on discipline. And discipline is both good and bad. It's good because it's discipline. We listen. It's bad is because, we listen too much.
Yeah, I know. And you're always afraid to say something because you think you're going to get punished.
We don't have as much lateral thinking, right?
Yeah.
When I started working in the U.S., when I studied in the U.S., but in particular when I started working in the U.S., I began to recognize something's very, very different. That you guys are much more lateral thinker. You're not afraid of hierarchy, which it's good and bad, right? It's bad because sometimes it's chaotic and anarchic and so on.
Yeah.
But it's very good because new ideas would often come out when you have a group discussion of 3 to 4 people, 5 to 6 people, and you never know who the ideas came from. Would come from.
Exactly.
It could come from apparently the dumbest guy, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But actually, he or she could come up with the most ingenious ideas. That happens with the American culture, which doesn't really happen in the Chinese culture.
And I think it's changing, though. It's getting better. It's better than when I first came here. I used to have to interrogate everyone just to have a conversation. Now I, just do it every so often.
but you see, I think what I'm trying to point out is that it's two different culture or two different systems, and a lot of the things that we're now seeing in terms of, let's say, the U.S.-China conflict and all the stuff, fundamentally is due to a lot about this economy. And this economy was set in stone since, in your case, several 100 years, or not more than 100 years, because
of course,
inherited from Europe in a way, right? And we, it's several thousand years since the ancient Chinese history. So it's been around for some time. But I'm pretty sure, if we are conscientious, we can come along and sort of find the meeting point in the middle that make things work.
Yeah, and I think it will eventually, like you said, sort of, there'll be a coming together. It will take time. And this is sort of, I always like to end on a positive note, and this is exactly the right issue I can address, is that, and I've talked to many Chinese people recently that, oh my gosh, Pompeo said this, Pompeo said that. And I'm like, calm down. It's just words. It's just noise. We Americans just love making noise. It doesn't mean we're real. Okay? If Americans were serious, they would be doing the draft right now. They would be doing a military draft. They would be calling up the army to get ready to go to the Asia Pacific. That's not happening. Okay.
you're right.
Yeah.
I think too many people just look at the symptoms, and
They're too short-term thinking.
that's
It's
too
too
short-term
short-term
thinking.
thinking.
Right.
Yeah, what's going on is it's like as we discussed earlier, the Americans have some issues to address with the Chinese, and they're addressing it the only way they know how, by complaining. That's okay. Okay, we Americans love complaining, and we'll use hyperbole. Well, the worst ever, the worst country ever, the worst moment of my life. Okay, it just is.
And you
It
guys
doesn't mean it's the worst.
and you guys
Okay?
are oftentimes very dramatic, right? In your outlook,
Yeah.
right? When you
Okay,
complain, just like,
drama.
oh.
I know. We love drama, but it does not mean it's real. Okay, folks, please, Chinese in China, I want all our Chinese viewers to understand it's not a coming war. There's no coming war between the U.S. and China anytime soon. Pompeo is not in charge of the White House. Trump is. And what's going to happen is basically you're having just say differences of opinion that seem strong for the moment, but I think within 2-3 months, when Trump really focuses on a U.S. economic rebound, he's going to see the advantages of welcoming more Chinese investments, for Chinese investors opening up factories in the USA, to bring in more Chinese tourists coming to the USA, for more Chinese students to go to the schools. When Trump sees the advantages of that, you're going to see a 100% about face, and then suddenly the Americans will go back to tolerating China again. Right now, people are very emotional, but it's not the end of the world. So China, don't get scared, don't get angry. This is just a phase, okay? It's not going to last forever. I've seen it so often before. And how would you like, before we get off, how would you like to address this issue?
I would like to add, I agree with you.
Yeah.
So, I hope Donald Trump would welcome more Chinese companies to go to invest in America, and also more Chinese tourists, more Chinese students and so on, going to the US and so on. I believe that, with the Chinese government commitment on continuing to open up more markets for American companies, you will see also increasingly American companies able to come to China and enter the market, capture the potential that the China market offers to them. And after a little while, the shareholders of these companies and also the CEO and board and so on are going to come to the conclusion that, despite all the political rhetoric and so on, the China market is damn important for us, and it's creating a lot of value for our shareholders, but also for our customers. And we got to, make our China operations work. I think a prime example of that is going to be Tesla. Shanghai, China for Tesla is becoming so important, and the Chinese government is supporting a lot Elon Musk on what he needs to do to be successful in China, right? So in 6 months from now, 12 months from now, Elon Musk is going to look at how they've been doing in China. I guess he will be very happy, and that will set a very good example for many other American companies when it comes to doing business in China. And in turn, they will send the messages to Washington, D.C., right? They will send the messages to the White House, and Donald Trump will receive the messages. And so I think these sort of things will make their way out, and hopefully things, can become more normalized.
Yeah, and I believe it will happen, but it's not going to happen this month. Probably not next month. Okay. Don't lose hope. Don't lose your patience. I think basically, from my understanding, it could be the unemployment rate in America could hit 25%. That's really bad. So if Chinese open up factories in America, Chinese put investments in the USA, I'm pretty sure Americans may at first be suspicious, but when they see that it's to their advantage and that they have jobs, they are part of the success story as well. That then you're going to start to see a slow coming back together, because my belief is U.S. and China, when they are working together, it's going to be the greatest. Well, here I am using hyperbole, but I do believe it. It's going to be one of the greatest partnerships in world history. It just takes time.
I agree. You know, I like a term that was put out, I think several years ago, I believe by Neil Ferguson. It's called Chin America, right? It's the combination of China and America. You know, you put the two together, it became, you know, one unison, right? One word.
Yeah.
And I believe that is the right blueprint to think about this, is that instead of China against US or US against China, it should be a unison where the two work together to create a partnership, because it's not only good for the citizens of the two countries, but the world actually requires these two great powers to work together, because increasingly the issues that we are now facing are global issues, right? The pandemic is a global issue, pollution is a global issue, nuclear war is a global issue, AI ethics is a global issue. We need everybody to put their minds together to come up with the best solution, right? And America and China ought to play the role of the joint leadership. And sure, why not, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly how I want to end today's podcast. What Edward is just focusing on is this idea of a partnership. It's a good idea. Don't be afraid of it. It's well worth trying. The person who contacted me, who's been, let's just say, very pro-American, said, "Is there a way China can help us?" I was shocked. You know, I said, "Yeah, okay. Don't be afraid to ask." You know, but this is what our show is about: talking about how the two countries can help each other.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we had a great talk today, and we'll be talking to our viewers again later on. Thank you, and have a good day.
Have a nice day. Thank you.
You too.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.